Thanks everyone for joining. It's good to see so many people here. This talk is about post-phenomenology and robots, and also a little bit about a literature review that we've done in program 2 that's speaking sort of into some of the same topics. So I wanted to give this seminar topic because I'm interested in post-phenomenology sort of broadly as a philosophical strand of thought. And I think it's something that sometimes gets overlooked because it can be very abstract and difficult to figure out what to do with it. So I'll try my best to put these sort of philosophical concepts into practical terms and maybe give some thoughts on what we can actually do with post-phenomenology. But I wanted to start by mentioning the background for this, so some key references first. So what I'll be talking about in relation to post-phenomenology will be based on the work by Peter Paul Verbeek and Don Eide. They are both philosophers. Peter Paul Verbeek is also now, I think, the chancellor of a Dutch university. But if anyone is interested in this topic and want to dive more into it, I would suggest one of these two or both of these two references. The first one being a very short introduction to post-phenomenology and some concepts that's published in the Interactions magazine. And the other one is a book that was co-edited by Don Eide, who's sort of the grandfather of post-phenomenology. So for anyone who's interested in the topic, I'll suggest these key references. And then as another background, I just wanted to say a little bit about where this presentation is coming from. So I'm a researcher in human-computer interaction. And so my interests are not necessarily just on isolated things to be designed and developed, but it's especially on the interactions between a thing and a person. So we could literally translate interaction as action in between, in the sense that it's something that happens between a person and a thing. So following that, interaction design was coined back in the late 1980s by Bill Moggridge and Bill Verplanck as they call it design for human use. So Verplanck described interaction design as answering three basic questions. The first one being, how can you affect the world? For example, using handles or buttons. The second one being, what sort of sensory qualities that shape the thing that you're interacting with. For example, does it invite for more interaction? And then third is how we learn and plan what to do next. So talking about design and interaction design in collaborative robotics, the goal is typically for people and robots to complement each other. So human-robot collaboration ideally combines human cognitive and sensory motor skills with robotic technical capabilities. So I brought in this definition from the Center for Work and Health Safety in New South Wales that says that collaborative robots are cobots specifically designed to operate alongside humans in shared and unfenced workspaces. So in that sense, cobots are designed to improve the economic working conditions, safety, quality, and productivity. And we have these definitions and they work really well to give us a pragmatic starting point for making these things like safety guidelines and setting up for organizational practices and so on. But they're also predicated on a specific conception of how we think about technology more broadly. And that leads to specific ways that we then develop and evaluate our robotic systems. And so I'll try to illustrate some other perspectives that we could take on that comes from post-phenomenology. So in our current conceptions, we make this conscious split between people as the users and robots as the technology to be used. And that split between people and technology seems to be an obvious choice to make, because people move around the world, they investigate things, they are curious about things, and things, on the other hand, are often just seen as sort of passive. They're things to be used, and nothing really happens without someone or some things that are using it. And that means that the quality of a technological artifact is typically thought of in terms of its functionality and its usability. And so that's how we evaluate our technology. And I think that there's a risk in that kind of conceptualization. Some of the ways that we talk about collaborative robots in ACC are, for example, in program 2, we talk about human-robot teams, so robots as team members. And Mark Carmichael has talked previously about the robot as sort of a helping hand for people. And so these ways that we talk about robots, I think, are attempts to give particular conceptualizations of how the robot works and how it should support people. And John made this great illustration with Bing, because we were talking about the robot as sort of more of a tool, like a hammer, in that classical Heidegger sense, the technology as a hammer. But the relationship between people and technology are part of a larger relation that's between people and the world. So technology is a thing that connects us to the world around us. And this is a basic idea in post-phenomenology. So for example, a smartphone connects us to other people virtually, to news around the world. It helps us to find restaurants in new areas, and it can be a platform for different kinds of work. So when we're designing technology, we're in effect designing human-world relationships. And that also means that we are actually designing who people are, because the way that we relate to the world obviously shapes who we are and become as people. So in that sense, technology is a mediator, and they can mediate that relationship between people and the world in many different ways. And so this is sort of a move away from that classical Greek philosophy that sort of favors the abstract and views materials and by proxy technology as a secondary thing, a sort of applied thing. So Heidegger proposed that technology is, he said that it's ontologically prior to science. So that means that our knowledge is highly dependent on our instruments. So we can't really take out the technology as sort of an objective thing. And so that it's this idea that post-phenomenology builds on. So Don Eide uses technology in a non-neutral way then by saying that it actually transforms our experiences. So he proposes 4 different types of relations that technology can mediate between a person and the world. So the first one being embodiment. So that's where the technology becomes part of the person who's using it. So for example, if you're looking through a microscope, you're not actually thinking about the fact that you're looking through a lens, but you're more focused on what you see as a result. Another one is the hermeneutic relation, where technology becomes one with the world rather than the person by offering some sort of interpretation of the world. So for example, like a thermometer that shows the temperature on some sort of standardized scale. A third one is called alterity, that a person is interacting with a piece of technology to achieve something directly with that. So for example, you could use an ATM to withdraw money. And finally, he proposes that there's a background relation where technology forms part of the context within which we're experiencing the world. So for example, an AC unit in our office that ideally we're not aware of unless they function properly and turn the office in S block into Antarctica or something. So John Heidi proposed these 4 different ways that technology can mediate human-world relations. And I think for robotics research, the publications that I've come across so far mainly looked into this alterity relation for robots as sort of people interacting with intelligent agents. But I think actually we could extend that and use these different relations as sort of inspirations to how we conceptualize robotic technology. But obviously, Don Idey's first book on post-phenomenology was published back in 1979. So technology has, of course, advanced since then. And so in more recent philosophy, Peter Paul Verbeek has extended the work of Don Idey to describe some additional ways that technology can mediate that person-world relation. So that's because some are more intimate than just an embodied relation. So for example, brain implants are not just sort of extending ourselves, but actually becoming part of ourselves. And some technologies are more merged with the context rather than just mediating a background relation. So for example, you can have smart environments like a fridge that tracks what you put into it and proposes recipes, what you can do with your ingredients, and tells you what to buy next. So circling back to the core of the Australian Robotics Centre, robotic technologies is one of these technologies that's where there are lots of recent advances, and so robots are, as you all know, expected to have a transformative impact on many industries in the coming years. So so part of the Robotics Center, we're looking at, rather than being these autonomous robotic systems that are designed to just replace human workers, new collaborative systems will work in areas that require a high level of integration between people and robotic competencies. And so in our recent literature review, we've looked into this area of computer-supported cooperative work to sort of build on these ideas. So the research of computer-supported cooperative work, or CSCW, is seeking to understand the characteristics of interdependent group work with the goal that we can design adequate computer-based technology that can support cooperative work. So early work on, for example, the introduction of technologies to support office work, such as electronic mail, calendars, groupware tools, they found that the failure of those applications were related to a few key problems. So, for example, a breakdown of decision-making and sort of an over-reliance on intuition during the design process. The second one being the complexity of trying to evaluate the success of these kinds of applications across a range of users. And third, that there can be inequitable benefits where tools that we develop provide benefit to some employees, but then create additional work for other employees. And I think that these are also going to be these are also going to be the case for robotic technology. So obviously, collaboration is a multifaceted term. It can refer to division of task burdens or working alongside each other. And given the fact that there's such a rich history of investigating collaboration in CSCW, we thought that, okay, there's a large body of research here that can actually inform our understandings of human-robot collaboration. So we wanted to look into what are some of the specific challenges for this, and what have researchers so far done in this area of CSCW and robotics. So we conducted 2 literature reviews. We conducted a primary one to identify robotics-oriented research that's published in CSCW, and then we conducted a secondary one to identify how CSCW has already influenced robotics research that's published at other outlets. So we conducted a search for robots in all CSCW proceedings from 1986 to last year, and then through that search, we identified about 300 papers that we then analyzed to see, do they use the term robot to describe a system that has a physical form as opposed to other AI systems, and looking at whether the study of the research question was actually primarily oriented towards robotics. So we had a corpus of 37 papers, and then for each of the 3 iterations of analysis, we took an inductive approach to defining analytical categories. So we wanted to reveal the where, how, and what of the research that's presented across the paper corpus. And so this led us to initially capture information about application domain, research methods, the different types of robots that people are using, and the different research questions that they're asking. And then in the final iteration, we went more in detail with the papers and looked at what are the key research topics that authors highlight. So the goal of the second survey was to investigate the influence of CCW research on the field of robotics. So to do that, we wanted to identify the references to CSCW papers in papers that are published in robotics outlets. So that wasn't an easy task to do. So we needed to identify potential outlets, and we did that using there's a global serials directory called OLX Web, which is a very big database. And so we searched that and identified different robotics venues, and then we performed a search through 50 different robotics outlets that then led us to find 138 papers that are published in robotics outlets and reference CCW somehow. So we looked at those papers to see which papers, which CCW and European CCW papers are they citing, and how are they explicitly, if they are, using the term CCW. And so, as you can see here, I just wanted to bring this up, that it is sort of an area that is increasing in interest. It seems like these fields are becoming more and more related as interests in these areas grow as well. And I'll just share some of our findings. I will try to keep this talk relatively short so that we have some time to discuss. But a key characteristic of the papers that we found was that there's currently a very strong emphasis on remote human-robot collaboration. So a lot of papers involved a person or a group of people that are teleoperating a robot, and so that obviously limits the types of robots that were involved in the studies. So this table gives an overview of robot types that are used throughout the papers. And so the application domains, they typically consist of these remote workers that are accessing office environments through mobile robotic presence systems. Though we did also find a few examples of people using these kinds of systems in their homes or for other social activities. But that's definitely something that colors the current research in this area. Another thing that was kind of surprising was that we didn't find many papers where more than one person actually interacts with the robot. And even then, they typically interact with the robot as a group from a distance. So there's there are very few examples where there actually is a direct physical manipulation of or a physical interaction with the robot. So in terms of the robotics papers, the CCW literature that they currently cite is typically the CCW research that involves robots. And so there's not that much engagement sort of with the broader area of CCW. And then for the papers in the robotics papers that actually use the term CSCW explicitly, not many of them actually cite a CSCW paper for that. So it seems like it's a familiar term, but it's not necessarily leading to any further engagement currently with CSCW literature. So interestingly, there were various characterizations of CSCW still in the paper. So this was a quote from a paper from 1999, where they give a broader outline of CSCW, and they recognize that there are different definitions, but then they offer this definition that is sort of technology agnostic. So they're saying that CSCW is a set of software, hardware, language components and procedures that support a group of people in a decision-related meeting, which is sort of, I mean, an old definition. So, but you know, the field has advanced since then. So more recently, CSCW is also used as a noun to describe, for example, a particular type of digital system. So through our analysis of all these papers, we identified some key research topics that sit across many of the papers. And so just looking at this figure, we acknowledge that theories and research approaches are typically not developed and used in isolation. You know, they overlap. They can inform research studies as part of larger theoretical frameworks that you construct to suit a particular research question. So that's also the case for the papers that we've analyzed here. And it also creates a practical challenge when we want to present them in fora like these in isolated categories. So we've tried to illustrate the research topics in this way as sort of three interdependent themes relating to organization, mediated presence, and communication. And I'll try to, I'm going to share a little bit about some of them, but I won't go into detail. So I should say that this is, we submitted this as a full paper to the CSCW conference, and we are still waiting for final notification on that, but hopefully you can read the paper next year. So within the organization topic, we identified socio-materiality as a key theme in the research. So collaborative work it's inherently dependent on how people engage with different materials, both physical and digital materials. And materials have previously been investigated in different ways in CSCW, for example, as artifacts. There was a famous example of a study looking at the ways that flight progress strips facilitate the communication in the UK air traffic control system. But materials have also been investigated as instruments. So, for example, handovers between nurses and surgeons in operating rooms. So these are three key takeaways from the current research in this topic. So the first one being the fact that robots can take on different social roles in organizations and that those roles can change over time. The second one being that since they are physically present, they come with different material constraints, and that can enable and even emphasize certain social practices. And the third one being a recognition that robots operate within the larger socio-material frames of an organization, and so they're also understood within those frames. As another key topic within organizations, within the topic of organizations, teamwork plays a big role in the current research, and I think that's also a core concern in the Robotics Center. So teamwork has been a core concern for CSCW research since it began, and so there was, initial attempts to categorize teamwork, such as time-space matrix, and that work defined early research in CSCW. But while teamwork is a common theme in the papers that we've looked at. There isn't that much overlap in the literature where that these papers build on, and that's possibly due to the fact that there's a high variance in application domains, so that the applications in the papers ranged from telesurgery, space exploration, SWAT teams, and video conferencing. So that obviously leads to highly varied types of robots and thereby also different ways to configure teamwork. But we did find three main ways that authors take a teamwork perspective. The first one being that we found a few papers that use knowledge about how human teams work to investigate how the configuration and communication strategies of teams change when the robot is introduced. The second one being that some authors utilize knowledge about how people work in teams to develop human-robot team strategies. So, for example, reframing human-robot collaboration through learnings about how people collaborate. And then some papers conducted research on how robots in teamwork impacts that teamwork. And the last topic I'll go through is just relating to the sort of broader topic of mediated presence. And so mutual awareness is a social phenomenon that describes how groups of people can rely on contextual cues from each other's actions that helps them coordinate collaborative activities. And so these cues, they can be derived directly through observation of others' actions, or they can be indirect by interpreting how artifacts in a shared environment have been manipulated. So a particular focus in CSCW research has been on understanding the role of awareness in collaborative work and also on designing mechanisms that enable computer-mediated awareness, both in distributed and especially in distributed and potentially asynchronous collaborative settings. And so awareness has been a focus for HCI and CSCW research since the 80s. And so it's not surprising that it also plays a role here. And we found that awareness research is commonly being referenced in studies where people and robots are not co-located. So for example, in remote surgical teams or SWAT teams. And robotics systems that are utilized for that work vary a lot in terms of the technical capabilities that make them suitable for particular tasks. So trying to connect the dots of the post-phenomenology and this CSCW literature review, we found in the literature review that there's a very tangled relationship between the fields of CSCW and human-robot collaboration, but these very varying conceptual interpretations of these key topics that relate to collaborative work suggest that the nature of human-robot collaboration research within CSCW is diverse, but also still scattered. So I think some key questions that we can begin to investigate now is relating to how we could diversify our research in terms of applications, robot types, and research methodologies, how we can adapt our methods to understand those complex relationships between people and robots. And then also thinking about how we could or should conceptualize robots as we design and develop new solutions. And I think post-phenomenology can play a big role in trying to tackle these questions. So connecting back to what I was saying about post-phenomenology, robots can enable certain actions and practices. So looking at the arrow that moves from the person to the world, for example, assistive robots, they can help people take care of other people, for example, in homes and hospitals. So in that sense, a robot can mediate relationship between a person and other people in the world. And so that also means that we organize our lives in a different way from before we introduce those types of robots. And in the other direction, the other arrow, for example, the Mars rover reveals, a different planet to us as a potential new habitat. So with this massive impact that technologies have on the ways that we live our lives and the ways that we think about our world, designers and policymakers have a pretty large responsibility to think about how, we're effectively making that impact. Another aspect to this is also that unique quality of robots, as we're often viewing them as sort of an other, but we can't really relate to robots like we do to other people. Robots are still, while robots, they're experienced as intelligent and independent, they have some autonomy and physical presence, but they're still a piece of technology, and so they might introduce completely new kinds of human world mediations that we haven't identified yet, having these unique qualities. So thinking about the ways that a robot mediates a relation to the world is not just an inspiration for new robot designs. I think it also prompts some ethical considerations about the eventual fallouts from our designs. And that's one of the main points behind the post-phenomenological approach. It's to give a framework to both understand, anticipate, and assess the impacts that future technology, including robots, are making. And so that I'll just say thank you for listening, and I'm very happy to discuss any of this. Thanks. I might just stop sharing my screen.
Stine, thank you for your talk. I've got a question. I'm wondering whether you could sort of expand a bit more on this notion of alterity. I think that's really fascinating. And I noticed that you sort of were mentioning examples that used intelligent agents, so some level of intelligence, whatever that might be. But sort of is intelligence a predicator for alterity in terms of, or is it sort of how people perceive the system? So is it about perception? Could a game, that's very engaging, sort of fall under that category? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, great question. I think alterity is probably the most difficult one to understand. I think maybe one other concept that we could use to think about alterity relations, it's another concept that comes from post-phenomenology called multi-stability. And so multi-stability is a concept that aims to describe how a piece of technology on the one hand can have multiple functions, multiple purposes. Like I can use a pen to write with, but I can also use it to put in my hair, and I can use it for all sorts of things. I can use it to hold up a window or whatever. So something like an object can have multiple functions and purposes, but at the same time, it also has, it consists of physical materials or digital materials that also put a constraint or make it stable. That makes sense. So when we interact with a piece of technology, like a robot, I think on the one hand, there's that sort of stability in that a robot has a limited number of functions, and it's sort of constrained in how we shape it and the materials that it consists of. But at the same time, we want these multi-purpose robots that can help us do all these fantastic things, and we might even, through our use of the robot, think of new ways that it can help us solve problems. So I think that's how I think about the alterity mediation relation. through this sort of concept of multi-stability. Does that answer your question, Marcus?
Yeah, it does. I don't want to hog all the time. I do have a follow-on. I don't know. I might just ask. So I'm wondering that whether the subjectivity plays a role there. So if we're thinking about how people perceive the robot and what the robot does, that will be individually different, right? People have different understandings of what the system does, and I'm just wondering where that sort of comes into play. In terms of alterity, so that seems to be,
I think so. I've seen a few papers published where they try to bring together ideas from post-phenomenology and affordance theory, and so that's specifically looking at the technology and also the spatial arrangements in our environment come with particular affordances. Does that make sense? I think that that would be, sorry, maybe you need to ask again.
No. Maybe I'll let somebody else ask a question. I'll come back to that one.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure where I'm going myself. So.
Well, if there are no more questions, I might just say thanks everyone for attending and listening. It's great to share philosophical thoughts as well.